Okay, Year 13, 5 minutes on this comparative question. The statement is, the US Congress is a more powerful legislature than the UK Parliament. Now we've got to analyse and evaluate this, so what we've got to know first of all is, why is this statement being made? We know that traditionally the US Congress is considered as quite an independent legislative body. The difficulties the President has in pushing their legislative agenda through there is well known, compared to the UK Parliament, which is often seen as a lapdog of the government. But we also have to, in our introduction, understand how we're going to define power. And I've put it in 3 ways. 1, how it can be based in terms of initiation of legislation, how you control the legislation going through different legislatures, and finally, the number of pieces of legislation that are actually passed. So if we look at the first one. Now when we consider the US, we can look at Congress in terms of its primary role, which is to make law. The executive has actually got quite a limited role in the initiation, probably with the President trying to prompt things through the State of the Union. UK in comparison, the government has a mandate to initiate legislation, and they really drive the issue through their manifesto. So the majority of bills that are going through are public bills from the government. Private members' bills in the UK are quite limited in terms of their opportunities, so MPs within Parliament have quite a restricted role in terms of initiation. You compare that to the United States, where the Standing Committee is critical to the introduction of legislation from different congressional members, and they really control the nature and direction of the legislation as dictated in that committee. Second point, one way to judge power is how the passage of legislation is dictated through. And as we can see in the US, they really do control the process. They can shape the speed and the nature of the legislation through the House Rules Committee with open and closed rules, the Senate using the filibuster to slow down or even force amendments through. We're aware as the process goes through that there can be pork barreling or earmarks added to the nature of legislation by individual congressmen. And in the end, the Joint Conference Committee dictates the final nature of the bill, showing us that across the United States, the Congress, there is real capacity to dictate the passage of legislation. UK in comparison, there really is the government, not Parliament, that dictates the timings of the bills. They can use guillotine motions, such as in Public Bills Committee, as we show with the poll tax, and they can really limit the capacity to delay bills by the House of Lords. Yes, they can do it, but for how long? It really isn't the same power as you can see in the Senate. I would argue, though, that a contrasting point, that you can say the UK can be more like the Congress when majority sizes are small, and therefore the party discipline that exists there can be less imposing upon that piece of legislation. The EU withdrawal bill under May's government is a good example of that, where she really struggled to control Parliament in wanting to impose its influence on that piece of legislation. Our final point is to look at the number of pieces of legislation that are eventually passed. In the United States, the one thing that is against them in terms of their power is actually their ability to really get legislation through, get it done. There's a very small percentage of legislation that's brought in that actually passes. And even when it does, there's still the problems of the potential of a presidential veto or pocket veto, and the capacity for the Supreme Court to strike down that legislation as unconstitutional. The reality is, although they can control legislation through, partisanship and the divided government that can exist between the House and the Senate can make it quite difficult for Congress to get legislation passed. Compare that to the UK Parliament. Very efficient in getting through its legislation. It has real power in getting legislation passed because of the executive power that's behind the Parliament at the time. The Supreme Court can only really deem laws incompatible, not having the same powers as the US Supreme Court. The one concern you would have is, yes, you can pass legislation quickly, but the quality of the legislation may be the concern. How much investigation has actually happened? The trade bill that went through in terms of Brexit was done in 1 day. How can that be considered to be an effective piece of scrutiny? So when we look across the whole question, and we look at the question of a judgment on this particular statement, yes, you can argue the US Congress is more powerful in initiation and passage, but you would have to also consider its ability to actually pass legislation in the end, and maybe the restraints that exist within Congress make it more difficult in that sense. Whereas the UK Parliament looks quite weak when you compare it to the executive power that happens within the UK in driving legislation through. There you go. Thank you very much.